Great, thank you, and it's great to see a kind of a packed room. So yeah, please do kind of scream out kind of questions as we go through this, but there's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end. So as you know, I'm Phil Venables, CISO Google Cloud. Got a great panel here today. Tim Crothers, my new colleague, the CISO of Mandiant. Ryan Kazanciyan, who's again CISO Wiz, and then James Robinson from Netskope as well. So really great panel. What I think is particularly good about this group is everybody is at the leading edge of dealing with advanced attacks. And so as we think about this panel of the adversarial mindset, I know all of our panelists today have to be inside the minds of the attackers because of the nature of the threats and things that they see. So I think it's going to be a great session. So just to kind of kick things off, I just want to kind of go down the line and get each of you to just spend a minute, 90 seconds, just kind of a quick brain dump of where you see the biggest things you're most concerned about, kind of what's going on, what's top of mind for you guys. So first of all, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. So I think those of you who caught the keynote this morning was a good introduction to where my head's on this, right? As Phil called out this morning, we're in this transition point where I think we've got a lot of new tools, a lot of new approaches, a lot of things. In particular, what I'm personally excited about is Microsoft and Google have clearly made intentional decisions that we're just going to start providing things more securely, right? You see Microsoft recently turning off macros by default and things like that, and really forcing the hands of the adversaries. And so we're seeing a rapid shift in taking advantage of that. Simultaneously, we're seeing a huge precedented uptick in cloud attacks. Particularly, we're seeing just a ton of exploitation on Office 365. Of course, a lot of us have moved to that platform. And to be clear, these aren't attacks at the underlying infrastructure as much as configuration errors. Or any of you who've run an Office 365 instance, there's a lot of knobs and dials to turn. And so as we, as security teams, deal with this, understanding, right, in this shared security model where we need to have the right set of skills, the right set of capabilities to deal with those sorts of transitions, I think our biggest challenge is it's getting faster and faster.
And in fact, the best thing about working with Google is you now get to switch from Office 365 to Google Workspace.
Indeed.
Like, what's to not like about that?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Having gone from back in the 2010s when I was at Mandiant being an incident responder and working cases that were by and large infections of on-prem Active Directory environments, today where I mostly focus on cloud security, it's been interesting to see this sort of arc. And I think what's most interesting about this point in time is we have proven on one side that we can build secure platforms and solutions that completely eliminate categories or surfaces of attack, or at least shrink them to things that are really manageable. Look at the iOS ecosystem as an example. On the flip side, we have also built scaffolding that allows us to build and ship software and services at a scale and speed that we never have before. And if you go to any Fortune 500 company going through cloud migration or any cloud startup that's building a new SaaS solution with a few dozen people, the rate of development is remarkable. And that accelerant, that fuel on the fire, is both a boon because we all use and take advantage of those services, but it has also changed what's expected and needed of security. And I think from just the point where we've started to catch up with how to secure and harden like a traditional corporate computing environment, we are only now learning that those models, from the technologies we use to the way we even think about structuring security organizations within companies, doesn't necessarily work in a model where we're building and shipping code every single day. And so the big shift for every facet of security work, security engineering, prevention, detection, response, is going to be to adapt to that. And I think we're at the very, very early stages of that journey across industry.
Yeah, I'd agree that the speed at which things are operating today is amazing. Obviously, the business and the landscape that we're in financially is one of the top of thing, or that's top of mind for me right now. And what I struggle with, I would say the most within my program, is not the foundations of security. Working within a security organization, everyone's there to tell me how to do my job, right? And that's the unique part of it. But the piece of innovation that you get to do is very rewarding. And then how do I bring talent into the organization and retain them is very, very difficult. So I would say one of the biggest problems I actually try to solve internally is not around the foundations of security, but around that talent gap and the speed, and then how the headwinds or tailwinds of economy or geopolitical situations, those types of things, how do they creep in, and then what does that matter to the platform, the system, my users, my engineers, all of the other folks within. That pivot, I would say, I was telling my team the other day, right now is when we actually get to be good leaders, right? When you get a little more budget constrained, when you have to actually look at things and understand, maybe I just can't go buy everything and waste money, right? Maybe I need to actually think about it. Maybe there's some things that I overpaid on. And that can be difficult as well. And so we promised that we would come from different areas as well. So all those items, are definitely things that I think about, but also just that bigger landscape sometimes is where's all this headed? I agree, we're very early, right? Very, very early. And things are very decoupled and very fragile. Right.
I mean, that's an interesting point, because like even inside Google, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we 10x the productivity of the people we've got through kind of like SRE type approaches, through kind of changes in workflow, through automation. And I think, it always kind of makes me, slightly, perturbed sometimes when we think about not just the budget challenges, but the cybersecurity workforce challenges when we get over-obsessed. I think it's correct that we should think about how do we create more cybersecurity professionals to join the workplace, but that can't be our only answer to solving this this challenge. We've also got to 10x the productivity of the people we've already got, and actually just make their lives better, because sometimes where you've got kind of challenges in operations teams especially, it's because they haven't got the best tools, they're not necessarily got the best job, and they're inefficient as a result, and getting some productivity out of them makes their job a lot better as well. But I mean, so kind of going straight to the heart of what we kind of kicked off with on the kind of the adversarial mindset, again, as I kind of said in the intro, all three of you kind of are in environments where you're probably every day seeing new types of attacks that you think like, holy cow, this is like, look at what's happening now compared to what we dealt with. And I suspect, while there's probably a lot of people in this audience that are feeling similar things, I guess you're seeing attacks that are probably a few months, if not a few quarters ahead of what everybody's going to see. So, I mean, just starting with Tim, given, because Kevin put you on the spot this morning about what you've got to deal with, what are you kind of seeing that you think everybody should be prepared for in the next months and quarters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from my perspective, the biggest change I'm seeing is we're seeing the adversaries get a lot more personal. So of course, everybody here is familiar with the ransomware problem. And of course, what we're seeing now is a layer of open source intelligence. So say they attack company X, they go do OSINT on who's the CEO, who's the CFO, who are some of the key leaders in that. Let's get their family members on social media, et cetera, and let's threaten them. Because of course, at the end of the day, they're trying to coerce a payment. So that's one big shift that we've observed recently that's a little concerning, right. Needless to say.
For me, an interesting and emerging area of research that a lot of my colleagues are working on is validating and in some cases finding holes in the isolation model that controls access to multi-tenant services and hosting providers. If you think about the landscape today, the vast majority of businesses are on the major three largest cloud service providers in the world, and each of them has dozens or hundreds of services that are in large part built upon open source software that has been adapted or modified to support multi-tenant environments. And because those are all services built by different teams in these large companies using different technology stacks, you end up with inconsistent layers of controls when you start separating who has access to what, how one customer can't interact with another customer's data. And when there are failures in those controls, the boundaries aren't always consistent. And I think researchers and attackers are just starting to understand and test those boundaries. And why I think that's significant is we are already many years into a large worldwide cloud migration with threat models built on assumptions about where security controls are managed by the cloud provider in that shared responsibility model. And as some of those assumptions become invalidated, it just upends everything. And it challenges assumptions that security and engineering teams have built upon. I think we're in the very early days of starting to see how that shakes out. Earlier this year, we showed one example, which was Postgres as a service and different cloud providers having different control gaps where you could potentially gain access to other tenants' data. And that's one of a pattern that we will see, I think, again and again in shared services. And it's, I think, incumbent on both the teams building on these services to start thinking about isolation in their own threat models, and then the service providers to start being more transparent and open and proactive in closing those gaps proactively, because attackers are going to poke at and find these holes.
One of the things when we were having this conversation about kind of the learning from the adversaries, and we were talking about it, and it really kind of came to mind that the adversary, it's not just one. It's not even, in some cases we can name a group. In other cases you can't even name the group. The adversaries are members that are coming together to solve a problem. And the problem just happens to be, if you want to go and pick locks, then they would go and pick locks. And I think, taking that mindset and understanding and trying to flip your teams to be able to operate that way. I still see within the organization, we still have our own boundaries. I don't see it necessarily across the business, but I definitely see it within the organization, say within my team. But if we have a sales problem, let's just say we're getting beat in a region or something like that, well then, sales gets behind it. They say, hey, what's the product problem? And what I see is business has become even Intel driven, and we've learned how to do that. And we haven't brought that into our own teams. And I think that if we look at our adversary, we can better understand how they're operating and where they're going, and take that intel, bring that in, and then be able to drive it out. We've been very threat responsive, I would say, not very Intel driven on strategy. And so making that change and that pivot to say, okay, we talked a little bit about what is my attack surface? Where is that at? Doesn't matter. How responsive do I need to be in some cases to customers? Now, we are super responsive. Are you vulnerable to this, right? That has been gone through the industry like crazy, and it caused us to shift as well. Why? Because the adversaries are taking advantage of said vulnerability, and so you have to understand your home a lot better. I think the one thing that we can also pick up from is, we know that when we're shifting to these new environments, as we do that shift, we have an opportunity to reset. And it's not only an opportunity for us to reset, but it's also an opportunity for us to put in an architecture that we have well documented, we understand it, we can see it, right? We have partners on both sides. We can do so in a way that isn't just going to live within my organization, but it can also be referenceable, because there's blueprints for it, which can be good and bad. If it's a solid architecture, solid design, solid engineering, then it leaves you with building basically for an organization that can respond really fast, and you have a fighting chance.
Yep.
So.
That makes sense. It's interesting, kind of, Ryan, one of the things we really liked that Postgres research you did, not least because we actually caught you doing it.
You did.
And so I think in the report it said we were the first cloud provider to actually catch kind of whiz research,
Absolutely.
which was
awesome.
So our detection and response team had a happy day that day. But I think you're right. I mean, one of the things I think we're investing a lot more in kind of putting in harder and harder multi-tenant boundaries between workloads. And I think that Postgres report was interesting because, when you look across all of your cloud providers, making sure that these products, particularly some of the open source things, weren't designed for multi-tenancy, how the cloud provider turns that into something that can have a strong workload boundary is actually quite hard. And, definitely I'd encourage all of you to kind of, grill your cloud providers on how that works. The other thing I would say is when you go to SaaS providers, have those hard conversations with your SaaS providers, particularly some of the big data SaaS providers, because they're not necessarily coming into the same scrutiny the big three hyperscalers are in terms of their security, and that's definitely worth doing. And then Tim, to your point, I think we're seeing similar things on insider threats. There's certainly been, as I think a lot of you are aware, a few companies that have had ransomware events where somebody's been bribed or extorted into bringing in malware on portable media where the digital defenses of that organization have held. And again, it's interesting on the cryptocurrency stuff, you got to be really careful as the CEO of a cryptocurrency exchange, because you're not just worried about digital attacks, you're worried about all sorts of other physical threats. But kind of, James, what you were saying as well on kind of, it's kind of cues up the next thing I wanted to talk about, which Tim, you talked about in the intro as well, which is as we get better as an industry like putting out controls that mitigate whole classes of attacks. I mean, again, kudos to Microsoft for some of the changes on the default Office macro policies. You know, I think we've done a lot in Google to shift the perspective on true phishing resistant authentication. A lot of the other big platform companies have done similar things. Just curious, and I'll start with you, James, this time, are you starting to see the attackers evolving, given we're taking those macro changes to defeat classes of attacks? You know, how does the threat landscape look like? And are the attackers moving as quickly as we always think they can in the face of these big changes that invalidate some of their easier to pull off attacks?
Yeah, I think that they are moving faster. And I think they're able to move faster because I think there's probably more exposure that's driving it. I don't know that it's necessarily because it's just because the class of or the family of attacks is being wiped out. I think it's because, as you mentioned, right, Ryan, there's plenty of providers. If you can't do it on one platform or app, then you can do it on another. But I think as we start to invest in some of the technologies, we've also, again, grown assumptions on those technologies, and all they got to do is just pivot just a little bit. In some cases, they don't have to make massive pivots. And I think that we have more adversaries, and I kind of also look at it from the Intel side, with what's going on kind of globally right now and the slowdown in all the economies. As that happens, we'll see new classes of hackers, attackers, and folks. I think that we'll probably see a lot more ransomware, those types of oriented attacks. But I'd say personally, one of my biggest areas that we're working through is on the API security side. I think it's been a blind spot for so many people for so long. I think your interconnected apps that you're actually bringing to the table, and then you said, you know what, I knew all these interconnected apps, I brought all my developers in, I taught them how to be secure developers and do the training and all, but you know what, and then I said, let's bring in a new class of developer that all they know how to do is drag and drop programming, right? And as they've done that, now they've enabled API keys that will never rotate, it's a deep integration between two applications that I have no visibility into, and now what? Right? And what does my attack surface look like when it's netscope.company.com, right? Because it's some tenant that's sitting on there, and how do I get that visibility into there? So that API security part is a big one, and I think that's probably where the shift could go, and it would be a lights out scenario. We've heard of very small attacks that have happened in there. And then the other, supply chain oriented type of attacks. I'll let someone else comment on that.
So it's funny, kind of almost tempting, I won't name them, but there's some kind of no-code, low-code platforms that you could almost brand as vulnerability as a service, because exactly the way they're kind of generating stuff behind the scenes is it's like generating vulnerabilities. And we're actually, again, I won't name them, but we're trying to strong arm a couple of them into improving their kind of code generation practices for exactly that reason. It's kind of interesting.
And we've kind of done it to ourselves in some cases. Security shouldn't be right, just standing to the side and saying. I mean, we've been taking advantage of platforms, SOAR and those types of platforms, and we've been creating. I look at it all the time. I look at the flow, and I'm like, did anyone actually look at the process here? Because you wrote problems into our own security automation, right? So that's we're doing it ourselves, and we should learn from that.
Yeah. Anything else from you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think we often, when we introduce a well-engineered system that closes off a vulnerability class or category, we're often, I think, naive as an industry in the actual time it takes for adoption to get to a point where it's effective. I think FIDO2 authentication is a great example of that, where we are now seeing less secure forms of two-factor abused, even though the techniques to abuse them, like TOTP replay, technically existed 4 or 5 years ago. Now, there's just adoption is high enough that it's worthwhile for attackers to build platforms as a service to abuse TOTP and other insecure 2FA. And so now we say, well, we've got passkeys with cross-industry push to get them deployed across products, consumer products. We've got things like YubiKeys widely available. Here's the problem: adoption with a consistency and completeness that it actually solves the underlying problem is still probably much further away. Like in any given organization, you will find pockets where dependencies, third-party applications, homegrown things can't support that yet. Usability is often something that people overlook with any security control. How does it impact accessibility? How does it impact support? What happens if someone's traveling and they lose their YubiKey? How do you recover? How do you trust the recovery process? Like, all of these implementation details, it's not just for FIDO2, it's for any security control, and it takes mass adoption to pressure test it, to find all the holes, And while you're going through that process, there's pain, because that's when attackers are taking advantage of all those weak points. Control isn't consistently applied, that's where the attackers go. Recovery processes or fallbacks are insecure, that's where attackers go next. And so I'm optimistic we still should be investing in building those solutions to take care of solvable problems, but we need to think in arcs of like decade plus to make these changes have the effect we want, not in the course of months or years. That's I think the realistic take.
Yeah, I was going to go exactly where Ryan did. Right, I think it's worth echoing, especially given the focus here is adversarial mindset. Adversarial mindset, at least for cyber criminals, is always consistent, path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Right, and so whatever that path of least resistance, they're going to use it until that path no longer exists, which to Ryan's point often takes years to actually eliminate, right? We have the tools to eliminate. You referred to this morning, right, in your discussion with Kevin. We have the path, or the tools rather, to eliminate a lot of these paths, but we don't get them implemented. But back to your question, when we do eliminate them, they move quickly. Right. The analogy I like to use, because I end up talking to a lot of non-technical folks, is it's not that the cyber criminals are smarter than we are. They're like 100% commission salespeople, right? They just bang on whatever they've got until it doesn't work and doesn't get them money anymore, and then they go find something new, right? And they're incredibly consistent in that. And so your specific example, of the macros, absolutely, we're seeing them abuse two-factor, just to Ryan's point. We're also seeing them start to actually abuse vishing, right? Where they're calling up, spoofing, right? Our red team did an exercise for us. It was kind of fun. They spoofed my SOC team's phone number to one of our sales folks. Was very effective at tricking the individual, as it should, right? We can't rely on processes, but then that allowed us to step back and then reevaluate, okay, here's how we're going to authenticate. If it's the help desk calling you as a user, we're going to authenticate like this. If you're calling in to have your password reset, we're going to expect you to authenticate to us like this. And so those sorts of things are what we're seeing coming out of that adversarial work.
I mean, it's kind of, we talk a lot about kind of authentication strength, and the thing I worry about is, we're going to all kind of high-five each other for rolling out FIDO tokens and other stuff, and yet already the attackers are moving to cookie theft. Yes. And so, we're seeing, across kind of some of our customer base a rise in cookie theft when they've just finished their implementation of their FIDO2 tokens, and they now have to kind of revisit all of the controls around browser implants and endpoint security, and which is why you see us now responding to that by pushing out kind of, cookie binding over MTLS for certain types of platform access. And we're going to clearly have to do a lot as an industry to kind of improve and change some of the protocols to kind of bind cookies to sessions. I mean, are you starting to see that from what you guys see, kind of cookie theft going up, and how are you seeing people respond to that?
But we absolutely are. Right. But I think that's the fault of us, which both Ryan and James I think have referred to pretty well, in that we tend to think, I think, at least in my experience as security practitioners, in little pockets of isolation. Oh, we've got to solve cookie theft. Well, cookie theft is just a means to an end. What they're doing is trying to bypass our authentication. Yep. And so we've got to look at the entirety of the authentication ecosystem, right? Not just that particular aspect where, they're deploying it via. No, we've got to rethink the entire ecosystem there.
And it creates some tough challenges for people running security programs, because the compensating controls are sometimes really impactful to your users or impossible to enforce. So telling your users don't use the same browser profile on your work computer that you do for personal browsing at home, because you could potentially be synchronizing like a malicious extension or browser session data between your compromised personal computer, which your company has no governance over, and your work computer. So how do you control that? Okay, I do manage browser, but now I have to control what browsers people use at work. Well, if I'm an engineer at work and I need to use a lot of different browsers, now what am I supposed to do? Are you going to manage all of them? So we create these sort of like really tough situations where we either have to fall back on security awareness, or we have controls that again are imperfect until the application layer can catch up with things like more secure session token usage to prevent the attack on that side. It's tough. It's just a constant cat and mouse game.
going to be fun. This is why, this is why we're all in this. It's just non-stop fun.
Yep.
So, like, let me kind of, a few of you brought up in the various other comments, like software supply chain. So, like, let me be a bit provocative here. So, like, software bill of materials. It's going to save us. Everything's going to be solved with SBOMs, right? So, who wants to give us a kind of a lecture on how awesome SBOMs are and how it's going to be perfect?
I will.
Yeah.
I love SBOMs. They're amazing. I wish every customer would ask me, because we put a lot of investment into SBOMs for FedRAMP, and I wish someone would actually read them.
Yep.
Honestly, I think the industry probably took that one way too far. It was, and I think that in some cases we might have made it too hard. I think the point, and people, it's hard sometimes to step back and really look at it and say, well, was that the law, or were they really what were they trying to get out of this law, right? And the SBOM one is I think one that comes to mind. I think, I really do applaud, for us internally, Dependabot is amazing, right? And what it can do. I just had to step aside, just let it do its thing. Then I just had to go and say, hey, you're going to see a PR, accept that PR, merge it in, got to do some extra testing with that one, but just go, right? I'd say, do I really then need to go deep in the SBOM if something's already going and doing the patching for me? Well, what was the point of the SBOM? So I would go through and I would look at everything and I would look at it. I think that's one part, and I don't know where it stops. I don't know where the SBOM stops, because if you're taking those low code, no code,
right,
and you're doing the integrations, so then what's your, I'll put it out there, like we started looking at this, what's your cloud SBOM look like?
Right.
What does it look like? What's your fourth party dependencies look like as it relates to all the cloud providers that you're using, and how do you bring that into your SBOM when it's all cloud connected code that's basically operating and running? And how deep and how far do you take that? What was the point of it at the beginning, right? Was just so you had a bill of materials. What was a BOM about? I mean, honestly, what was the bill of materials about in the first place, right? There was tax implications on some cases. It was about what products go into it. There was health safety. There was all kinds of stuff. Is that really what we're trying to get out of this? In some cases, yes. But do we have a better way of solving it? I would say is probably also a yes.
We as an industry tend to, I think, over fetishize visibility. And if you look at any enterprise product, it's almost always one of the selling points. Like, we provide visibility into this thing that you don't have good inventory over. Apply that to any class of problem that is part of any security vendor's pitch, including my own. And I think the problem is when visibility gets too far ahead of actually being able to do anything with the data from a preventative standpoint, you have to take into consideration how large that gap is. And what I see now is that most developers are already overwhelmed with low signal vulnerability information that they have to ignore or deprioritize when committing and fixing and shipping code. And so you see lots of alerting in development tool chains that don't result in like land blocking signals, things that are actually blocking a developer from shipping code to production. And if something isn't a viable enough signal to be used in that preventative context, and you don't have a good story for how you're monitoring that signal to detect anything in a reasonably efficient manner, you're just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. And that isn't to say that it isn't valuable to have transparency, and software composition analysis is incredibly important. But I think if we consider it a control when it's just better visibility, it's not actually acting as a control yet. We're not doing anything with the data. No one will be doing anything practical with the data for quite some time on the consuming end. And I think what we need to do instead is think better, take a better approach to how we prioritize vulnerabilities and assume that control failures are going to occur where we deploy code. Assume RCE is going to happen in components of your deployed services, and figure out how you contain that. Not assume that you are going to fix it on the back end because you knew that a dependency you pulled in happened to have a vulnerability. And I think that's the sort of tension in the system we have now between wanting the insight and figuring out, like, how the heck do we use this when we can't even address vulnerabilities we're getting from container image scanning or any form of source control scanning.
I'm very outcome driven at this point in my career, and so I have a bad habit of taking it back to, all right, what does this actually accomplish, right? And I think both James and Ryan have articulated well. SBOM partially came about because of SolarWinds. We could have had all the SBOMs in the world; they would have done nothing to prevent SolarWinds, right? That wasn't the root of the issue there. So So again, I think Ryan articulated that really well. I think we do need that visibility, but we need to understand when we've just got visibility versus an actual control that's helping to resolve anything.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, I was obviously being slightly facetious in my opening that we're very supportive of SBOM as a necessary but not sufficient condition for software supply chain and broader security. Kind of the analogy that we often use is it's like, you're in a restaurant, you see the ingredients of what went into your food. You're still not going to be that comfortable unless you know how the food's made, that the chef has good hygiene, that the place is clean, and the production process is pretty solid. So it's a combination of both things. So I was just about to go to questions, and then there you go. You got your hand up.
So I'm going to throw it out there, right?
Yeah.
So Log4j comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
If I had an SBOM, I knew really rapidly, 4,000 apps, 4,000 to 5,000 apps. I got really quick to the point. The ones that didn't have SBOM, well, how long does it take?
Yep.
And in your restaurant scenario, you don't know all the ingredients, but if you heard on the news, there's a romaine lettuce recall, the 5th one in the last year because of farm XYZ, and you see that, well, this salmon's all romaine and yours doesn't. Maybe I'll just choose a different menu item. Right? I'll choose a different package, right? There's a simile there. Without knowing the details, it may help to make a risk-based.
But here's the thing, that knowing where Log4j is doesn't mean knowing where there's actually exploitable Log4j.
Yes.
And in a large organization especially, you can waste infinite time trying to whack-a-mole every instance of a non-exploitable vulnerability that poses no risk.
Which we had to do. We had to do that internally because we had customers saying.
I work for Ford Motor Company. I think I qualify for size.
Yep.
And as I said, thousands of apps. It makes a huge difference if you can snap it out quickly, right?
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
You don't have time to research everyone.
Yep.
Yeah.
You just say fix, update them all.
Yep.
So I don't think any of us are saying there's no value in SBOM. The problem becomes we've got to be, I think, very intentional about what this gets us versus what it doesn't, and then what's the work effort in that, right? So where I'm concerned with the SBOM situation is, I think the original intent was good. I think it does absolutely bring some value to the table. But now we're seeing certain sectors, certain industries, say financial services comes to mind, where they're asking for a ridiculous amount of them, right? Way past where it provides value. And so now all of a sudden we're in a position where we're dedicating resources to providing SBOM that we could be leveraging to actually solve things.
To manage the audit.
I'm with you, right?
Yeah.
Teeter-totter, right?
Yeah,
You gotta
exactly.
balance.
That's
It's
right.
all about risk.
Well, and actually, let me kind of switch it back to adversarial mindset. So, imagine a future where we've got SBOMs, we've got everybody's on Salsa level 5 for their production process. All of this, it's all great. What do the attackers do then? Where are the attackers are going to go after that? Because it's funny when I think Kevin may have mentioned it this morning when I kind of saw SolarWinds. You think you're kind of slightly depressed by that, but at the same time you think, this is great. Attackers are having to go to this length now because we're doing well at closing off the easier paths, and that every sophisticated attack is a little bit of a victory because we're making them work. But again, imagine the rosy future of software bill of materials, complete kind of software supply chain security. Is that the end of software supply chain risk?
No, I think the vishing I gave example earlier is a good example of that, right? Where we saw a legitimate instance where this happened, the victim shall remain nameless for obvious reasons, where attackers sent malicious software to a user. They tricked them into believing that it was actually the help desk of the organization. The company's preventative controls stopped the malware from deploying, et cetera. So the user called them back and they said, all right, well, what's your personal email? So they sent them to their personal @Yahoo, which they opened in a browser on their desktop, downloaded the malware, completely bypassing the company's control structure and infected the laptop, right? There's always going to be a path of least resistance somewhere in there.
Cool. Let's open it up for questions. We've got 10 minutes left, so you either ask questions or I keep going on with my boring questions. So come on, please. Question. There you go.
I would say that we're still in an era of MFA adoption. There was some statistic I read in Microsoft's environment where there's still, 80% of customer accounts still need coverage with MFA. As we see the adoption with MFA increase, I think we're seeing more question is, how do you believe MFA needs to evolve? What is the next gen of MFA? Where are there currently deficiencies that you feel need improvement?
I mean, I think like FIDO2 and WebAuthn protocol-driven authentication is the right solution. Be it like passkeys or hardware tokens like YubiKeys, integrated hardware tokens like Touch ID or Windows Hello as a backing factor. Like that is the right approach, and at least from a cryptographic standpoint, at least seems resilient to attack now. What I think the challenge is just adoption and usability. I'll give a specific example. If you use Outlook for iOS, Microsoft does not support FIDO2 authenticators for any Mac OS or Android mobile apps, nor for any apps on Mac OS like Office 365. Can't use it. Full stop. You can use Windows authentication, but you can't use FIDO2 authenticators yet. Sure, they're working on it. I'm sure they'll ship it. But there's a lot of companies out there using Outlook for iOS right now. And that's one of many things. How do you get your users to do 2FA authentication with a YubiKey on mobile? Do you enroll them in Hello or Touch ID or Face ID? How do you support, again, recovery when that 2FA method no longer works? I think usability is the key thing, especially for something like that, and also thinking about accessibility concerns, which the moment you make a control mandated for everybody, you have to think about how does this work for everybody, regardless of their personal circumstances. Yeah. And it's very hard to build secure solutions that meet all those criteria. So that's the long pole in the tent.
Well, and I think the inverted is true as well. Again, I think we as an industry will get some stuff like MFA, and then we'll just MFA all the things. I was on a website yesterday, personal, nothing relevant, right? And it popped up and said, oh, we need to MFA. So they email it, and it's like an 8-digit character thing for a website that has no personal data, no relevance, et cetera, but they're just blindly MFAing, right? And when we do that and don't think about usability, to Ryan's point, I think we're going too far both directions.
I'd say to add on to it with the adversarial mindset, what comes next after that is some of the other problems that we have today. So what about service accounts? It was a good conversation yesterday.
Yeah.
What do you do then? Right, and how much visibility, how much capability do you have to then add multi-factor onto service accounts? And that's a tough one. That's a tough one to solve. Again, inside of your own enterprise, outside of your own enterprise, inside the cloud, right? And that's going back to adversarial. That's where it's going to go next. And yes, we just got done with MFA, and then it gets abused. The other day, I kind of felt good that I was still actually entering in codes because we had a wave of people who were getting all the pop-ups and the push notifications, right? And you're going through and you're saying, well, I guess that usability factor there got abused, right? And yes, now we're starting to actually bring that into pen testing because we know it's a vulnerability. We know it's a weakness. People will do it. So.
Yeah, a more recent technique that we've seen that relates to some of that similar, we're now standing up, Azure tenants to run O365, et cetera. A lot of us are putting in add-in platforms in order to provide different services. The adversaries are well aware of that. We're seeing a raft of compromises of those add-on applications running in our tenants, which then have inherent trust. Their actual target is our O365, but they get there through the vehicle of the additional tenants.
Other questions?
I'll go for a second one.
Go.
So you went in the MFA discussion. I thought it was very interesting. It's much more than usability to push stuff out too often, right? Cost to the business and all that. But also the MFA fatigue one. I love some of the recent attacks. Mm-hmm. If you push people, they become, if they weren't weak to start with, they do. Okay, you annoy me. I'm going to say yes after the 50th time that pop-up. It's not a pop-up from a legitimate source. So yeah, now I said okay. Now let that give me access. I grabbed your token. I grabbed your cookie, whatever. Now I am you. So there you go. MFA be damned. I'm the you. So.
Yeah, and it was a weakness, not necessarily in the authentication, but then in the session management, which didn't carry along with it. And then, was there telemetry within that to say, this is, a fast mover, or this was, something like that, which can also be, something that they can get around, but it's those steps, right? And I still think that defense in depth, I don't know that we play it out all the way all the time. I still, huge believer, we got a threat model, continue the threat model. I cannot believe, honestly, the industry doesn't share threat models. I tried creating a OWASP community to share threat models, generic threat models, open threat models, whatever it is, doesn't exist. Why not? Why, going back to adversarial mindset, why can't we do that? Adversaries can do it.
They do it better. They
Yeah,
share much
here's an attack. Well, why can't we say, oh, here's a threat model? We see it every day. All of us see it every single day. Don't share it. We may share a TTP. We may share something like that. But we don't share, here's the full threat model of how I actually looked at this to secure it. And here's more vulnerabilities that come so we can identify new classes of vulnerabilities. Pen testing organizations have it. I was at one for many years. They had entire classes that you would go through. I'm sure Mandiant has the same thing, but they don't share that. That's intellectual property at that point, right? And so I think that we have to get better at that. If I was to say, if we really want to solve for, where's MFA going and what's the weaknesses within that, and why didn't we solve it by moving our entire enterprise and asking every user to go do enrollment, use their personal phones to do this, or give them phones, and we took all this burden of cost on for a small weakness to cut right through it. So
playing off you, right? Isn't that a maturity issue? Just imagine if you went to your family doctor and he saw something, he diagnosed it. He's like, well, I'm not sharing because I want to write a paper on this, and I have to publish it. I'm not going to let other doctors know I saw this new disease that popped up. I want to make sure I get 5 more patients. Nail this down.
But he'll have 90 days to do the disclosure, though.
yeah.
90 days to do the disclosure.
But it's the same thing.
It is the same thing, and we don't learn from other industries in many, many ways.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the organizations I work with are thousands of employees and security staff of less than 10. So with that in mind, what are the adversarial mindset, what are the priorities there that every organization, regardless of the size, their security staff should identify and prioritize? And then what are kind of the next steps after that?
Well, from my perspective, I think regardless of organizational size, where I see a lot of the breaches, I'm just have been a fan of for many years of what are the systemic reasons this happened, right? Not necessarily the specific reason, but what led to that being the case in an organization. And I think we often get entranced by the new cool shiny tools. We don't keep our tools running well. We don't focus on the fundamentals. The security fundamentals really, really work. If we do them well, we continue to do them well, right? That gets us a lot right then and there. And so to specifically answer your question, in my opinion, I would start with that focus. Make sure that you've got, good identity access management, right? Good basic prevention controls, so on and so forth, right? Those simple but fundamental things. They aren't as cool maybe as some of the more higher tech types of approaches, but they work, and they've worked for a long time. And when we stop doing them and take our eye off of them and they fail is often when the breaches actually occur.
I would say it's also valuable to figure out how to get more non-security people to contribute to security outcomes. And the way I look at this is attackers tend to behave more like startups where people wear lots of different hats. The team running the attack platform as a service will also be doing customer support for their own customers when they need to. Like they are willing to wear lots of hats and serve lots of different functions. In organizations, sometimes like the org chart, the term shipping your org chart, like security is often the victim of that, where we get too clustered into thinking security work has to happen here, here, and here. Shifting that, I think, is part of the mindset I alluded to earlier, where we're building too fast and at too great of a scale now to make that sustainable. Like we have to equip engineers, application developers, infrastructure engineers, cloud development teams to do better security work and to care and have a vested stake in security outcomes. And I think that changes how security teams work with them, how we pick solutions, build technologies to enable non-security people. I think that's the shift we need to see.
I would agree with a lot of those items. I would say an underfunded, unsupported program, the better that you can get into the business is going to help support you, right? I've evaluated, when I was doing consulting, evaluated too many times organizations that were so focused on either a compliance initiative or something like that they lost sight of what the business value was, and then they lost sight of what the new initiatives that were coming that were really going to revolutionize the business. They just totally missed them. They were too focused on getting their PCI rock done, and so then they missed a whole new arm of business that spun up to basically go make 2x whatever the company was already making, right? That was the future of the company, and you missed it, and you didn't embed anything into that organization. You didn't put any requirements into there. You didn't even try to get a champion over in there. Even though that would have been one champion to 1,000 people, at least it helped to multiply that in many ways. So, understand your business, understand the organization. If you're a developer, development type of organization, or if you have supply chain and that's something, then you can take a lot more leeway into that, and you can relate to them a lot more. And I think security still doesn't know how to do that. I had that conversation just this morning. I was late to one of my meetings with a colleague just because of that, right? And when you go into Best Buy, you deal with one person. You don't deal with a team of people. You don't deal with multiple people. And we lose sight of that. Well, this team has to do this, and privacy has to do that, and design and threat modeling has to do that, and the pen testing team has to do that, and the response team has to make sure that you have to do all that for compliance, but then you lose sight of why were we actually doing this, and what was the business value of it. And what can the business just run with this? Can they do it on their own?
Cool. Okay, we're at time now. So again, I want to thank you for your attention. I mean, a couple of things I took away from this. One is, as Tim said, as we all know, attackers are rational economic actors. I kind of like to think attackers have bosses and budgets as well. And so we can get inside their mind and their economics. But the consequence of that is as soon as we close off one opportunity, they're going to go after the other and the other. And the second thing I take away, and it's great that we've got a packed room here today to talk about this adversarial mindset, because one of the things, I've been in security longer than I care to mention, and the great thing about this compared to other fields is it's one of the places where we all get together and network with each other to take the mindset of the adversaries to kind of push back on them just like they push back on us. And we're in this for the kind of the long-term battle. But I kind of, like I said this morning, I'm kind of long-term optimistic. I think we're definitely turning the corner. And the more we get together in rooms like this, the more we're going to keep pushing that boundary. So again, thank you to the panelists. Give it up for what was a great session.
Thank you.